Hello, I'm Deb Wenger, and this is the first lecture for Journalism 101, Introduction to Mass Communication. We're going to be using the textbook Mass Communication, Living in a Media World by Ralph Hanson. I highly encourage you to purchase the textbook and be sure that you keep up with the reading. My lectures will highlight some of the more important concepts in each of the chapters, but reading the text will also help you do well on your quizzes and exams in this course. So let's get started with a fundamental definition of what is communication. If you look at it at its most basic level, it's essentially how we socially interact at a number of different levels through messages. So in order for us to understand mass communication, I think we have to look at the various forms of communication and how they interact with each other. So there are 4 levels of communication that we're going to discuss today. First is intrapersonal communication. So your mother may have told you, think before you speak. And in fact, that's a form of intrapersonal communication. So the conversations that we have with ourselves, such as, gosh, I wonder what I want for lunch today, or, I wonder if I should call her or if I should just text her, which would be better. That's a form of intrapersonal communication. So it's conversations or communication you have with yourself. Then there's interpersonal communication. So this is communication between you and your roommate, you and your mom, you and your boyfriend. This is communication between 2 people, and you're essentially sharing messages back and forth with each other directly. Then there's group communication. I would say that what I'm doing right now is a form of group communication. So one person is communicating with an audience of 2 or more people. When a coach gets all the players together in a huddle to discuss strategy, that's a form of group communication. So group communication is like interpersonal communication since it involves more people, but it's generally one person acting as the sender of the message and multiple people within a group acting as the receiver. Then we get to mass communication, where most of our discussion in this class is going to focus. So it might help you to visualize this information in this graphic. If you'll notice at the very bottom of the pyramid is intrapersonal communication. So most of the communication that occurs in our world is probably intrapersonal. You think about it, every single person is having an internal dialogue with themselves at some point or another. So many senders of information at the bottom of the pyramid in intrapersonal communication. A lot of folks interact interpersonally, right? So you're having a lot of conversations throughout the day with the people that you meet, a lot of one-to-one interaction. Group communication probably is a little less common. Now, in a university setting, you're going to be exposed to quite a bit of group communication every time you go into a class or you log on to hear a lecture in one of your online courses. It's a form of group communication. But at the very top of the pyramid, there are relatively few organizations or individuals communicating in a mass way. So mass communication across society has fewer senders. So as you go up the levels of communication pyramid, you have fewer and fewer people sending messages. And if you go down, you get more senders. So what is mass communication? It's when an individual or an institution uses technology, so that's a real key to it. Mass communication is always going to involve some form of technology. They use that technology to send messages, and the audience is made up of members, most of whom are not known to the sender. So this is key. Most of the time in mass communication, the person sending out that message is not going to know the people in the audience. They might know some of them, but they certainly won't know a majority of the people in the audience. So taking a look at this again, give you an example of why I think mass communication is not disappearing, as some people argue, but rather it's increasing thanks to technology. So in the midst of all the chaos surrounding the Ferguson case and the shooting this past summer, a lot of people were commenting about it. One of the people who commented about it was a player for the New Orleans Saints, happens to be an African American male, and he wrote a really thoughtful Facebook post about the whole topic. He did not intend that message to be a form of mass communication, but when he posted it on Facebook, it took off and it went viral and it ended up in my Facebook feed. And so I would have never read what he had to say about it had mass communication not made it possible for his message to get to me. So I think that technology has actually increased the amount of mass communication, but the number of big major entities disseminating information to mass audiences has probably decreased. So you can see why some people make that argument. On the other hand, I think that the ability for information to go viral has increased the amount of mass communication occurring. So let's talk a little bit about the players in the mass communication process. You've already heard me talking about senders. So the sender is the heart of any form of mass communication. So it's an organization or an individual who's responsible for the message being sent. That message has to be created and transmitted by the sender to the receiver. So the message is the tweet that you write or the video story that you produce. That's the message. You also have to determine what channel you're going to use to transmit the message. So in the case of the tweet, you're using the web. In the case of the broadcast story, you are sending that via television. And then finally is the receiver. So the audience for the mass communication message. So these are the traditional players in the mass communication process. It might help you to take a look at this process by laying it out in a diagram. So here you see the sender takes the information that they want to communicate and encodes it in some way. So crafting your tweet or creating your video, that's a form of encoding. Then determining the channel through which the information, the message is going to be sent. And then typically in mass communication, there has to be some sort of decoding taking place. So with the web, you need a browser. With a television story, you need a television set, right? And then the receiver takes that information and processes it. So in the midst of all this, though, of course, there may be noise. There may be things that interfere with some stage in the communication process. So noise might be an interruption in your internet service. Or if I'm watching television and my son's upstairs playing Xbox with 5 of his friends, the noise that they create might interrupt my understanding of the story that I'm trying to watch. Also, in today's media environment, there's the possibility, and a greater possibility than ever before, for the receivers to offer feedback to the sender, which can then affect the process in how the messages continue. So if you tell me that you don't agree with what I just tweeted, that's going to change the messages that I send going forward. So I think that this diagram can help you sort of visualize and understand a little bit better the players or the components of the mass communication process. So people who study mass communication have come up with a series of models that help with our understanding of how mass communication works. So for example, what we just discussed is the transmission model. And though some people say that the new forms of communication, the more interactivity involved in media and our better understanding of how media works have actually made this model a little bit dated, it's still really useful for identifying the players or the parts in the process. So certainly senders, messages, channels, and receivers are a part of every one of the processes that we're going to talk about here in just a second. A newer model for understanding mass communication is called the ritual model. So in the ritual model, media use is an interactive ritual by audience members. And it looks at how and why audiences consume the messages that they take in. Example that I thought was particularly relevant to this is the Super Bowl. So the Super Bowl is coming up, and I would guess that a great majority of you in this class will end up watching the game. And it's quite likely you'll watch it at a Super Bowl party or with a group of friends. That's most likely how I'll watch it too. Now, I'm not a big football fan, but why will I watch the Super Bowl? Because it's become much more of a societal ritual. I, for example, will get a kick out of the commercials. I'll probably pay closer attention to the halftime entertainment than I will to the actual football game. And for days afterwards, you'll be in conversations, and I'll be in conversations about the ads that we saw that we thought were great. And so the Super Bowl is less about the football game and less about the messages being disseminated around the football game and more about the shared viewing experience of the whole event. Another model, and please, wish we could talk here. Shout out if you know who this is. But why do we know who this is? Well, Kim Kardashian is a good example of a publicity model in action. So this looks at how media attention itself makes a person, concept, or thing important. You might have heard the expression in the past, famous for being famous. On some level, the Kardashians are that, right? And so sometimes the mere act of the media concentrating on a particular topic will make that topic seem important. Another example, seems like every other summer or so, we will hear about shark attacks. And everybody will get really nervous about going into the water because sharks are attacking more frequently. But often if you look back at the data, you'll see that shark attacks are actually decreasing. But because the media are focusing attention on a particular topic, it raises the level of importance for that topic. Another model is the reception model. So this takes a look at the fact that it's actually the audience that determines the meaning from media content. So for example, if I'm listening to Rush Limbaugh on the radio and my husband's in the car with me, what he's hearing from Rush Limbaugh is the same words, but we're deriving different meanings from it because we don't always agree on the political spectrum. I might be listening to Rush and think, oh, what a windbag. And my husband's thinking, listening to Rush, going, wow, he's dead on. He's absolutely correct. So the reception model says that really the audience gives the messages meaning. So those particular models have evolved as the entire media world is evolving. And it's really useful for us to look back to understand where we are now. Now, I'm not the kind of person that's going to expect you to memorize a lot of dates, but there are some key points within the media world's history that I think are worth referencing directly. And I want you to at least have a sense of what came before what. So 1100 to 1400 AD was really what we would consider the pre-mass media communication kind of network. So there was really no technology involved. That's why we say it wasn't actually mass media. But for example, the Catholic Church, I think, is the example used in the textbook, was able to communicate to a wide audience its beliefs and teachings. And it did this through word of mouth, through group interaction, through some written types of texts. But by and large, there was no technology. When books were written, they were written by hand, so it was a very slow process. But still, widespread communication did occur. In the 1450s is when we hit true mass communication. Development of movable type and printing, the printing press, allowed exact copies of the same content to be created much more rapidly when you consider everything was done by hand prior to that. In 1814, so it took several decades, but this is where technology really ramped up production. So with a steam-powered printing press, copies could be generated at unheard of speeds. So you could turn out more and more examples of the same messages, whether that was in newspapers or in books, and get that information in the hands of a true mass audience. Then a big development again in 1844 when the first U.S. telegraph line was completed. This allowed us to communicate in nearly real time words across the country. There's an expression, the medium is the message, Marshall McLuhan, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through this class. And in this case, I think the U.S. telegraph line being created is an example of that. So the medium used, the channel used, actually changed the message. So prior to this, you might write a sentence, please send me money, I'm trying to get to Alaska by next Friday. Well, when this was communicated via telegraph, the message was send money, stop, Alaska by Friday, stop. So the medium, the need to send this via a telegraph where you paid by the word, created a change in the message. What's the modern day example of this? I think a lot of you are thinking right now, Twitter. How did Twitter, and the fact that we were limited to 140 characters, change the messages that we send? For me, it changed them significantly because I tend to be a little bit wordy. So I have to really think about the most concise way to communicate. So technology sometimes changes not only the way we consume content, but the way we deliver content. In 1866, about 20 years later, now we go global. Now mass communication goes global. We're able to not only send messages across our country, but really around our world. So more evolution takes place in the 1880s with the invention of the gramophone. So recorded voices, recorded music. We can now share the symphony that only an audience full in Carnegie Hall could hear with anybody who happens to have the right decoder, right? So this is another example where that SMCR model comes in. So as long as you had that gramophone, as long as you had the ability to play back the recorded music, you had the ability to listen to something that had happened hundreds and hundreds of miles away on a totally different day. In the late 1800s, we have the development of radio. Now we get voices and music in real time. This immediacy, which has become such a huge part of our media environment today, really began in the late 1800s with the development of radio. In the 1890s, we get motion pictures. So we're able to actually view events occurring on a big screen. Again, something that had never been done before. So able to communicate a different type of message to a mass audience. In 1939, about 50 years later, the first television broadcast. So again, we go live. Again, we have that ability to send information, video and audio, in real time. It was a big then gap between the development of television broadcasts and, of course, really television took off in the late 50s and 60s, but there was a pretty significant gap in terms of major technological developments in the media world. But the big kahuna in the 1990s was the internet becoming a channel of mass communication. And that has really started a period of rapid change and development, similar to what we saw in the late 1800s, right? So we had a number of developments from just before the 1880s through the end of the century. We're now in the middle of another period of rapid development and change. 2000s, the rise of social media, which has again really changed the paradigm for mass communication. It's allowed the sharing of content to leave the control of the sender to some extent and put it in the hands of the receiver, who then becomes another sender. It's still changing, it's still evolving. In the late 2000s, we saw mobile devices shaking up the media industry once again. The ability to consume full-length movies on the device in your hand. The ability for you to access the web and find the information that you want when you want it has had a major impact on the way media is delivered. In the 2010s, which we're in right now, we're hearing a lot about wearables. This guy has a pair of Google Glass. I can tell you that I think there are only 2 pair on campus, and I actually have one of them. If any of you ever want to play around with Google Glass, just email me, let me know, and we'll try something fun with them. But Google Glass, a lot of folks say, is never going to take off. But at the same time, Fitbits, another form of wearable, not necessarily a mass communication device at this point, but wearables are having an impact. And the future clearly seems, most experts indicate, that somehow we are going to wear devices that make our communication and a mass communication much different than it is today. So with all this technological change, media literacy becomes more important than ever. And media literacy essentially involves the audience members' understanding of a series of things. First of all, how the media industry works. So in my family, our understanding of how the cable companies try to wrench as much money out of you as they possibly can have led us to try to be a cord-cutting family. So we try to make do without cable TV, using Netflix and Hulu Plus and various other online services, so that we can avoid paying into the big cable conglomerate, right? And if we didn't understand that we had that option, we wouldn't have even considered trying to save some money there. We also need to understand, as members of the audience, the messages delivered by the media, to understand the source of the message and what that message is trying to do to us. So I use the example of the ASPCA commercial where the little animals are behind bars and it tugs on your heartstrings, right? Every time my son sees that commercial, he wants to donate his life savings to the ASPCA. But that's a message that's been carefully crafted by the media, and we need to understand what they're trying to do. They're trying to play on our emotions. That's a part of media literacy. It's also important for us to understand the roles that media play in society. So the media gets bashed a whole heck of a lot. But the reality of it is that the media plays an important role in supporting our system of government, in supporting democracy. I challenge you to point to any country with a democratic government that does not have a free press, that does not allow free speech. It's essential. Our ability to publish and our ability to speak about anything that doesn't harm someone else, or that you can't yell fire in a crowded theater, but our ability for the most part to say what we think about anything we choose to speak about is an important part of what keeps our society defined as it is currently as a democracy. And then finally, how audience members respond to media and their messages. So we also have to understand basically how we ourselves and how the people around us are responding to what they hear in the media. Kind of a lightweight example is every time Powerball in states that sell lottery tickets goes over 100 million, it's very likely that another 10, 20, 30 million are going to be sold. And that's because the media reports on it, and that has an impact on audience behavior. And understanding that and understanding that probably means you're going to be less likely to win the lottery than you were before is a part of what we're talking about here. So understanding both how the media works, the messages that they're trying to deliver, the importance of media for both ill and for good, and the impact that media messages have on people and our society is critical to our successful operation within the society. So there are some basic dimensions of media literacy that I think might help clarify any questions you might have about what we just talked about. So one dimension of media literacy is the cognitive dimension. So this is our ability to intellectually process information that we hear in the media. So, when Ebola was a major topic of discussion in the news, some people were very fearful of contracting Ebola, even though the risk was relatively low. So the cognitive dimension of media literacy was not all that high in people who were very frightened that they might come in contact with the disease. Another dimension is the emotional dimension. So that ASPCA commercial I just talked about with all the little furry friends behind bars, that is very much an example of a message that plays on your emotions. And so understanding what the media is trying to do and either allow yourself or not allow yourself to be manipulated by it, it's important that you understand it. And then the aesthetic dimension. So maybe you're listening to music and you hear a new song and you're able to evaluate, is this high quality music? Is this important content that I should be listening to? Or is this something that I reject? Same goes for movies or for books, evaluating them from a critical or artistic point of view. And then finally, the moral dimension, talking about music. So a lot of times hip-hop music will get criticized, for example, for its anti-women or anti-law enforcement themes. And so understanding the values of the medium that's communicating the information or the message itself is a part of media literacy. So the final bit of information I want to share with you in this lecture is in your text called The 7 Truths They, in quotes, don't want you to know about the media. So these 7 truths are going to be referred back to time and time again throughout the text. And I think it's going to be important for you in your success on our quizzes and tests to really understand them. So the first one, it's kind of a given in my view. The truth one is that the media are essential components to our lives. So I just saw a study not too long ago that was a little bit disconcerting. Said some significant percentage of people would be more likely to miss their smartphone for a week than if they didn't see their family for a week. Now that's a little scary to me, but it is a reality. I hear about people all the time that go to sleep with their smartphone tucked right near their head. Some people even wake up during the night and check their smartphones, which again, I think is crazy, but it might just be because I'm older. But media are everywhere and they're an essential part of our lives. Truth two is there really are no mainstream media. You may not hear this term very often, but certainly I do because I study and read about journalism and mass communication. But there's this idea that, upstart media like Vice or BuzzFeed are somehow totally different than traditional media like the New York Times or NBC News. And the reality of it is, you look at something like Bleacher Report, as soon as it gets successful, it's bought out by Turner. So there really is no us and them kind of thing within the media, that essentially all media are, if they're a media business, trying to do the same thing. They're trying to communicate to as many people as possible and to make money in doing it. Truth 3, everything from the margin moves to the center. So this is the idea that things that would be considered completely radical 20 years ago become just a commonplace thing in the future or in the now. So for example, I think your textbook uses the concept of gay characters on television. 20 years ago, you would not see two men kiss on television. Even today, it might be somewhat controversial, but it certainly is occurring relatively commonly in media. And you look at a movie like Brokeback Mountain and its incredible popularity. So a movie like that would have been censored back in the 1940s and 50s. So everything that's considered kind of marginal eventually moves to the center and becomes more mainstream. Truth 4, nothing is new. Everything that happened in the past will happen again. So I think your textbook uses the idea of music and the fight to keep music copyright protected was very similar to the fight to keep movie copyright protected back when the VCRs first came out. So these things happen over and over again. Old media are never really replaced by new media. We still read books, right? So that really relates to truth number 5, which is new media are always scary. Every time some new media type is created, people who are attached to quote-unquote old media tend to get a little panicky. Oh my, the internet is going to kill newspapers. Well, my guess is that there will still be newspapers, but they may not provide the same function that they have in the past. Radio is a great example of a medium that has reinvented itself over and over and over again. Every time a new media form kind of threatens what it does, when Pandora came out and took some of the music audience away from radio, they reinvented themselves as more of a community source. Satellite radio has changed radio once again. It's become much more niche oriented. So new media are always scary, but they rarely, if ever, replace old media. Truth 6 is the idea that activism and analysis are not the same thing. The textbook uses the example of concerns about violence on television affecting children. And so, making that your stance and saying that's wrong, we need to change it, is not the same as really understanding the correlation between violence on television and what would actually need to change to make a difference. So oftentimes you'll hear people reacting, and we'll talk more about this in the next chapter with the media effects discussion, but you'll hear people talk about the impact of the media, and they're making a cause and effect when there may or may not actually be a correlation there. And the final truth, truth 7, there is no they. So when we talk about the media, there really is no huge mass of people who make up the media who decide what it is that you're going to watch or what it is that you're going to have access to. The reality of it is we're part of the media. We get the media that we seek in many ways. Yes, you can access BuzzFeed to figure out what state you were really meant to live in, or you can access the New York Times and read about what's happening in North Korea. So all of those media are available, just as there are many, many people in the audience for this lecture taking away different things from what I have to say. There are many, many people that make up the mass media audience and the mass media environment, and they all influence each other. So these have been the big takeaways for me from Chapter 1. I hope that you will also read the chapter because I believe you will pick up more understanding of these concepts that will help you in our assignments and certainly in our quizzes and tests.